Hello, everyone, and welcome to this kind of a different Conversations on Groong episode. We almost thought it was a spotlight on silence, but maybe you can decide and you can tell us which one it is. Armenia's present political crisis is not limited to elections, arrests, or struggles between the government and the opposition. It also concerns memory, who may be remembered, which losses may be mourned, and which parts of Armenian history may remain visible in public life. The removal of memorial images, pressure on expressions of nostalgia or attachments to Artsakh, and official efforts to redefine national loss raise a larger question. Is this Armenian state trying to control not only the political actions, but also the language, symbols, and emotions through which society understands and processes its past? This episode attempts to place those developments in a longer historical frame. This month, on the 90th anniversary of Aghasi Khanjyan's death, we examine the Great Purge in Soviet Armenia, the destruction of political and cultural figures, and the lasting weakness of public memory surrounding those events. We then return to modern Armenia and ask which comparisons are valid, which are not, and what the current concentration and patterns of political and economic force may mean for our country. For this, we are joined by our guest today, Dr. Pietro Shakarian, who is a professor historian of the Soviet Union and Soviet Armenia. Hello, Pietro. It's always great to have you on our show.
Azbed Hovik, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure as always.
Welcome, Pietro. Before we turn to the Great Purge, let's examine what is going on in Armenia now, today. Recently, a 10-year-old girl displaced from Artsakh, from Stepanakert, drew the iconic Grandma and Grandpa monument, a symbol of Artsakh, if not the symbol of Artsakh. The administrator from the girls' school in Yerevan removed it from an exhibition, from a school exhibition, and branded it as anti-state. You heard that right. You heard that right. Not a weapon, not a slogan, a child's memory of home, her longing for her homeland. Some will call this an act of one overzealous official, but when an official believes that censoring the displaced child will please those in power, and there are a lot of precedents for this type of action in Armenia today, the order does not need to be written, it does not need to be explicitly recited. The regime has already dictated that memory is forbidden. The girl's teacher restored the painting and then resigned in disgust rather than remain in a school that treated a child this way and her expression. Meanwhile, across Yerevan, authorities are removing murals of fallen soldiers as cleanup. Meanwhile, graffiti that is 10 feet away remains untouched. So what is being cleaned, the walls or the memory? Pashinyan rejects the legacies of the Artsakh movement. Now, even a child's painting of Artsakh is treated as an act of subversion, while images of fallen soldiers are erased from public view. And this is how repression enters society. First, the state punishes the opposition, then it teaches officials to punish memory. And soon, even a child's longing becomes a political offense. So, Pietro, with this setup, I'd like to ask you, before we turn to the Soviet period, how would you describe the current political and social atmosphere in Armenia today?
Oh, it's extraordinarily tense, Hovik, unfortunately, because of these artificial, divisions in society that Pashinyan is introducing, because also of the attacks on national identity. So this erasure of, the memory of the soldiers, the memory of the heroes of the Artsakh War, particularly the 2020 war in Artsakh, and also, even this effort to kind of completely blot out of Armenian national consciousness, this idea of Artsakh in any form, that this actually has been going on for quite some time. It's part of a campaign against the Armenian national identity that this government is initiating, with the overall message being that, forget about what makes you important or what makes Armenia unique and interesting and separate as a national culture, as a national entity. And instead focus on just the material benefits, just focus on getting that money into your pocket and just forget about everything else that's meaningful to you, So that's what is really going on right now. But like I said, the pulse of the society right now, there's a lot of tension with this because people aren't comfortable with it. People don't agree with this at all in general. And yet it's being forced on the population. And you have a prime minister, you have a government that is imposing itself on the population at a time when people don't feel like this. People want to move on. And yet this government continues to impose itself and impose its will against the wishes of the people. And that actually was most vividly expressed, we saw in this most previous election, where it was overtly rigged. It was overtly rigged, and the population felt like in the aftermath of that, people felt like as if their voice was taken away. That any kind of democracy that the people had been fighting for, since the Artsakh movement, because the Artsakh movement, Hovig, as I always stress, was fundamentally about democracy. It was about, first and foremost, the rights of those people in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, to determine their own future. And when the prime minister recognizes Nagorno-Karabakh as a part of Azerbaijan, he's basically saying, I don't care about this right of self-determination. I don't care about democracy. All I care about are my profits. All I care about is staying in office. That's the highest value for me. My power is more important than the principle of democracy, than the philosophical idea of democracy. People feel as if, number one, their voice is taken away from them. And number two, people feel as if this government is imposing something on them that is alien, like to redefine the entire Armenian national identity on the map of post-Soviet Armenia, to really kind of make that the cornerstone of the identity, as if there is no larger Armenian history that goes back centuries, as if there is no large transnational Armenian diaspora that does not necessarily define its identity on the map of post-Soviet Armenia. That's what I think is most disgraceful about this. People they're not accepting this. They're not accepting this by and large, and yet the tension originates from the fact that the government continues to attempt to impose this on the people. People just feel uncomfortable and they feel tense about it. Then also people's jobs can be at stake if they work for the government. There's all sorts of kind of tension within society, still lingering tension over people who, the minority who support him, the vocal minority who support him versus the majority who really are exhausted with the whole situation and want to move beyond it, and they want to, their country to have a real future. So that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, as I passed by some of these murals in Yerevan, I always, took a picture and spent like 30 seconds at least looking at the soldier depicted, and it grounded me, at least personally, in what my life means, and if these people have given their lives for the values they believe in. And it is surreal now that we're talking about democracy, but I think this transcends even any definition of democracy. But the larger picture is, who has the authority to decide whether these images, these murals, are vandalism, public art, or sites of memorialization? We can go to any city and see public art that is not sanctioned, but is still preserved, is still allowed to exist. And this is very important existential imagery, right? Can control over memory become a form of political control? Is that what's happening in Armenia today?
They're trying to do that. They're trying to kind of control the memory. I mean, they're trying to control the discourse by kind of blotting out inconvenient parts of the Armenian national, memory. But it's not working because people still feel, a sense of loss. They still feel a loyalty to this. This was a major national struggle that people went through. It's a major national trauma. And not only that, it's also to experience the loss to a force as disgusting and as, I guess you could say, authoritarian and disgraceful as the government of Mr. Aliyev in Baku. I mean, we're talking about a fascist government, and really to kind of impose that outcome of that conflict on the Armenian society. It's not easy for people to take. Right now, the government is trying to distract away from this by trying to create artificial divisions between Hayastan seas and Artsakh seas and all this and that. Even, like I said, to try and redefine the entire Armenian national identity. We're talking about thousands of years of Armenian national identity, to redefine it based on the map post-Soviet Armenia without Artsakh. That's actually the key part.
And we don't even
Without
know what
Artsakh,
that map looks like in its final form.
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
It's a work in progress.
It's a work in
shrinking
progress.
day to day.
It's shrinking, and yeah, absolutely. I mean, and what can you say though about this? That this is an effort to re-engineer the Armenian identity to suit a kind of a political interest, and to suit to really kind of, I guess you could say, appease a very disgraceful, distasteful regime in Baku, that to really kowtow to it. I mean, this is kind of classic, appeasement, on the order of what we saw in the lead up to the Second World War, on the level of like the Munich Accord. I mean, we're talking about that kind of thing. I mean, Pashinyan, I mean, he's on par with Neville Chamberlain in that respect. So that's how this is. That's really what it feels like.
Pietro, what are the implications of Pashinyan's rejection of the Artsakh movement and its legacy? Because he has expressly said that the Artsakh movement was a mistake. He rejects it and he wants it forgotten by everyone.
The Artsakh movement, Asbed, is the fundamental cornerstone for the Third Republic of Armenia, which is the post-Soviet Armenia, the independent Armenia that we have today. That all began, that all emerged, the Third Republic and its independence. It all, of course, there's also the larger context of the dissolution of the USSR, but in the Armenian context, it was driven by the movement to give the Artsakhs the right to determine their own future, right? Gorbachev was coming in saying, we're talking about Glasnost Perestroika, democratization, right? And the people in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh were saying, well, if you're talking about democracy, then why can't we make our own decision? And then eventually that movement that began in Stepanakert, that began in Artsakh, came to Armenia. It didn't begin in Armenia. It didn't begin in Yerevan. It began in Stepanakert and came to Yerevan. And the Armenians in Yerevan, the people of Yerevan, the people of the Armenian Republic, began to express solidarity with Artsakh. And sooner and over time, this movement, to support the self-determination of Artsakhs became a larger movement, really, we're talking 1990, 1991, advocating for the self-determination of Armenians from the USSR in general, for the independence of Armenia. So when he's questioning the Artsakh movement, when he's questioning that, what he is doing, Asbed, is he's questioning the foundations of the Third Republic of Armenia. That's really what he's doing. And that's why every Armenian, every decent Armenian should be outraged by what he's doing, because it's an attack on the Armenian independence. He's attacking Armenian independence in many ways, we can say. I mean, the attacks on the national identity, the idea of trying to force territorial concessions to Aliyev against the will of the Armenian people by trying to redefine the Armenian national identity, remove Mount Ararat from passport stamps, blot out murals of Artsakh heroes, all this and that. But he is, by saying the Artsakh movement was a mistake, what he's really saying is that the independence of Armenia in 1991 was a mistake. That the Third Republic was a mistake. That's really what he's saying, Asbeth.
That's right.
Genocide, we're not talking about the genocide today primarily, but also we should not forget that also memories of the Armenian genocide are also being somehow de-emphasized or erased. And this is all part and parcel of that package.
And Hovik, that too is connected with the whole Artsakh movement, because the memory of the genocide, especially after the Sumgait pogrom in 1988, that memory of the genocide became part of what fueled the Artsakh movement. And even before that, we can go back to 1965, to the precursor of the Artsakh movement, which was the 1965 demonstrations, I should say in plural, demonstrations in Yerevan, advocating for the recognition of the genocide on the 50th anniversary, which eventually led to Tsitsanakabert and the memorial of the genocide being built in Yerevan. So all of this is being attacked by Pashinyan when he says the Artsakh movement was a mistake. What he's really saying again is he's saying that basically saying that the entire Third Republic is illegitimate when he says this. So what it's utterly disgraceful. In my point of view, and I say that, by the way, as an academic. I say that as a scholar. I say that with somebody who has the authority of a researcher, somebody who has worked in the archives in Yerevan and in Moscow, who has studied these issues backwards and forwards. And it is utterly appalling to me to hear something like Pashinyan, to hear someone like Pashinyan say that, really, this 1965 demonstrations in Yerevan, maybe that was a KGB plot or something like that. We have documents from the Russian archives in Moscow where, the KGB, they're expressing concerns about the rise of Armenian nationalism. They're expressing concerns about, Armenians making, territorial claims and so on and so forth. We have internal documents from the KGB from that time. So for him to say that really contradicts the factual history. The factual history.
You have a lot to teach to this government. They are absolutely illiterate, and there's no way to forget our history simply because it keeps repeating itself. But
Absolutely.
Look, today's situation in Yerevan may not compare exactly to the events in other countries or in history, but does raise an older question. What happens when political power begins to decide which histories, which identities and memories are acceptable? To understand why that question carries so much weight in Armenia, we need to return to one of the darkest periods in its modern history, a period that you are an expert on, the Great Purge, the campaign of mass political repression carried out across the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, precisely from 1936 to 1938.
Yeah. During that time, under Stalin, party officials, intellectuals, clergy, military officers, former political figures, and ordinary citizens were arrested, exiled, and executed as alleged enemies of the state. Although the purge, of course, was directed from Moscow, it did not. Although the purge was directed from Moscow, it did not unfold in the same way everywhere. In Soviet Armenia, it was shaped by local struggles over power, culture, history, and national identity within the Soviet system. So, Pietro, can you tell us what was distinct about the Great Purge as it unfolded in Soviet Armenia, and how exactly did local political conditions shape who was targeted and why?
I think this is an extraordinarily important question, Hovik, because at the core of it was the ability of Armenians to express themselves nationally within the framework of the Soviet system. Because Aghasi Khanjyan, who was shot by Lavrenti Beria, to give our listeners an idea, he was the first secretary of Armenia at the time, the first secretary of the Communist Party in a republic like Armenia, right, was the equivalent of like governor. So Khanjyan was basically kind of like the governor of Armenia, and in that position, he was very generous toward the Armenian national identity. He was a loyal communist. He was loyal to the Soviet state and to Soviet socialist ideology, but at the same time, he also was a national communist. He expressed, kind of Armenian national interest within the framework of the Soviet system. He's somebody who was patronizing and very close to Armenia's national intellectual figures at the time. People like Yegashe Charents or Axel Bakuns or Vahan Totovents or Zabel Yesyan. Many, many writers and intellectuals came under the patronage of Aghasi Khanjyan. And why this is so important is that the Armenians could understand what was going on in the Caucasus at the time was that Lavrenti Beria, who, as we know from the history, later became the head of the secret police of the entire Soviet Union, right? Stalin infamously introduced him to Churchill as our Himmler, that this is the Soviet Himmler, right? This is a kind of very sinister character. And Lavrenti Beria was from Georgia. He was the first secretary of Georgia, so he was the governor of Georgia. And really what he wanted to do was to establish a complete control over the whole Caucasus. In Azerbaijan, he had his buddy, his political ally, Mir Jafar Bagirov, running the show there, doing repressions there, right? So that was taken care of. But Armenia was giving him a hard time. The Armenian national intellectual figures who were surrounding Aghasi Khanjyan, people like Charents and Bakuns and many others, they were opposed to Beria dominating the Caucasus and to establish kind of a complete dictatorship over the Caucasus region. The most vocal individual associated with Khanjyan at this time is a gentleman who is obscure to us today, but his name was Nersik Stepanyan. If you go in Yerevan and you are by the Chadens Memorial Museum or the Chadens House Museum, and this is by around on Mashtots Avenue, right? If you're familiar with this building, that there is a right next to the Chadens Memorial Museum is a placard indicating this is the place where Nersik Stepanyan lived. Nersik Stepanyan was somebody who was vocally opposed to Beria. He compared him to Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Beria had written a book, a revisionistic history of the Bolshevik movement in the Caucasus that emphasized his role and Stalin's and de-emphasized the role of Armenian Bolshevik revolutionaries, people like Stepan Shamian. And the Armenians were saying, well, you're rewriting history here. That you're trying to impose a version of history on us that's has nothing to do with the reality. And they began to protest. They began to push back against Beria. What Beria did was he ended up having Nersik Stepanyan arrested. And then, infamously, on July 9th, 1936, Beria shot Aghasi Khanjyan. And this is really seen as the starting point for the Great Purge in Armenia, right? One of three major phases of the Great Purge in Armenia, but I can get to that in a moment.
Yeah. And to what extent was the purge directed not only against political dissent, but also against the Armenian national identity? You mentioned some of this, but also was there a lot of expression about cultural distinctiveness at the time? And of course, the memory of the genocide was still fresh. We had a lot of refugees in Yerevan still now trying to build a new life in Soviet Armenia. Can you tell us some more about some of these expressions that were perhaps found to be offensive by Beria and Stalin?
Beria wanted complete, control over the, as I said, he wanted complete control over the entire Caucasus, and he also did not want the Armenians to think too independently, which also meant to put restrictions even on cultural independence. Beria installed in office in Yerevan his two cronies, Amatuni as the new first secretary, replacing Aghasi Khanjyan, and Hachik Mogdusi, who is the head of the NKVD, or the head of the secret police chief, local secret police chief of Armenia. And what did they do to attack Armenian national identity? They went exactly against all of these figures who were so loyal to Khanjyan, who were really kind of, I guess you could say, the carriers of Armenian national literature. And Armenian national culture at the time. People like Charents and Bakuns and Totovents and Yesyan and many others, they were all arrested during this period. Armenia's top intellectuals were arrested during this period. In some cases, they were killed, they were murdered, they were shot immediately after arrest. In some cases, they were exiled. In the case of Charents, he died in an NKVD prison after being beaten to death, effectively. I mean, or at least this is what many people, say. So this is the period that we're dealing with, and also the assault on the Armenian Apostolic Church. This was a major thing. The Armenian Church. I mean, you have to again consider the fact that in the Soviet Union was officially an atheistic state. There was a hostility, built into kind of the Soviet approach to things that was opposed to religion. But at the same time, in the Armenian context, in the period of the 1920s, the NEP period that preceded the Stalin era. Now, NEP, New Economic Policy, for our listeners to understand, under Lenin in the 20s, there was a kind of a mixed system where there was kind of a market socialism. There was elements of capitalism and socialism in the same system. And this time, Armenia actually did pretty well in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And the Armenian government under Myasny Khan and other leaders at that time, actually, they were more lenient toward the Armenian Church. Why? Because the Armenian Church was recognized as a pillar of the Armenian national identity. I mean, you could, maybe there were some, ways to attack it in the press or this and that, but at the end of the day, they were not going after the institution completely aggressively. they understood that this is a major, this is almost a bridge too far. This is a major cornerstone of Armenian national identity. As the purge heated up, I mean, you had, Mogdusi in office as the head of the NKVD in Armenia. There was a full frontal assault on the church, to the point that the church was nearly, wiped out, nearly completely made extinct. Especially by
it was certainly decapitated.
It was decapitated by 1938, right? So I mentioned that the Khanjyan phase, where really Beria's cronies, Amatuni and Mogdusi, are going after everybody. There was a second phase and this is about from July 1936 to September 1937. Then from September 1937 to about, I want to say, October 1937, there was a direct intervention from Moscow, and then from October 1937 to maybe February 1939, there was like a final phase. In that final phase, that's when the head of the Armenian Apostolic Church, Horen I, was murdered by an agent of the NKVD on what many people believe to be the direct orders of Lavrenti Beria. So this was a full frontal assault on the Armenian national identity, on those figures, like I mentioned, like Charents and Bakuns, who were working on ways to, have a compromise between the Soviet socialist identity and the Armenian identity within the same system. Because you have to think, the Armenian nationalism, Hovik, is so incredibly powerful that in that context, in that society, in that system, you have to make compromises. It's almost inevitable. And
Pietro,
yeah.
Can I ask a quick question on
Sure,
that
go
very
ahead,
point?
Oscar.
Because I've been waiting. I wanted to know if in the South Caucasus, were the repressions and the purges much harsher and more vicious in Armenia than, for example, in Georgia and Azerbaijan, and why? Maybe you may have answered that by saying that our identity was so strong, our nationalism was so strong that maybe those were the causes, but I want to hear what you think about this.
Well, actually, it's quite interesting because Beria is often actually the repressions in Georgia, even though Beria was a Georgian, the repressions in Georgia were exceptionally harsh. That's actually one of the twisted things. Against his own people, he was especially cruel. And even back by the time we get to the 80s, there's a first wave of de-Stalinization, which I love to always talk about under Khrushchev. But then there was a second wave that began under Gorbachev. And it really commenced with this release of this Georgian film by Tengiz Abuladze called Repentance, which dealt directly with Beria's role in the repressions in Georgia in the 1930s. So this is something that this memory of the Stalinism in Georgia, I mean, it was in many ways in Georgia itself, it was actually worse than even in Armenia. And in Azerbaijan, it was really a living hell. That Beria's man, Bagirov, was completely destroying the old elite. And you also have to think, what did the old elite mean in the context of Soviet Azerbaijan? Soviet Azerbaijan, in those earlier years of the Soviet Union, was a multi-ethnic republic. And the idea, the approach to identity was similar to kind of the approach toward nationality, I guess you could say, in the Baku Commune. It was a multi-ethnic republic. You even had an Armenian, Mirzoyan, as the first secretary of Azerbaijan at one point. Kirov, the famous Russian Bolshevik revolutionary who was assassinated in 1934, was also the first secretary of Azerbaijan. And so along with the Turkic Muslim Azeris, you had Armenians, Georgians, Russians, Jews in the leadership positions in Soviet Azerbaijan at the time. And what happened under Bagirov is the entire orientation of the republic was more geared toward the Turkic Azerbaijani element. So Azerbaijan under Bagirov took on a much more Turkic national identity. And as part of that, by the way, I should also mention, national minorities were also attacked under Bagirov's reign in Azerbaijan. In Nagorno-Karabakh, the repressions were exceptionally harsh against the leadership of Nagorno-Karabakh, actually, by the way. So that's another whole thing, that when we talk about the repressions in the Armenian context in the Soviet Union, we should also not forget about Artsakh being part of that element, right? Soren Badamian, one of the leaders of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, later met with Anastas Mikoyan, along with a group of rehabilitated old Bolsheviks from Baku in 1964, as a matter of fact, and to expressed to Mikoyan and Khrushchev, oh, yes, we need you to keep on with this de-Stalinization, rehabilitations, and all that.
Pietro, you've ascribed a lot of these atrocities and purges to Beria himself.
Mm-hmm.
How direct was Stalin's and Moscow's role in the Armenian purges, especially during the intervention of 1937 and on?
During the intervention of 1937, Stalin gets directly involved. Now, a lot of people in the post-Soviet space today, I mean, not just in Armenia, but in Russia, in Georgia, among some people, there is this idea that, maybe Stalin, maybe he didn't really know everything that was going on. Well, actually, if you look in the archives and you do the research in the archives, you see that Stalin's, fingerprints were all over the repressions in the 1930s, in particular, this direct intervention. So Amatuni and Mogdusi, and the interesting thing is, cronies of Beria, they killed Sahakter Gabrielian, a famous Armenian old Bolshevik, right? They basically, what happened was, or he killed, or they killed him or he jumped out the window. What happened was he was arrested in Moscow. He was transferred to Yerevan. They were interrogating him, and he either jumped or was thrown from the third floor window of the NKVD building in Yerevan, which is today the building of the National Security Service in Yerevan, and he fell to his death. And Amatuni and Mogdusi failed to tell Stalin about that. Stalin was enraged, and he sent an entire delegation from Moscow to Yerevan to deal with the issue directly, right? And this also included, by the way, a 5-man NKVD brigade. So for a period from about September 14th, 1937 to about, I want to say maybe October 20th, 1937, the Internal Affairs Commissariat of Soviet Armenia was run directly by Moscow itself. The leadership of Armenia was purged. This is when Stalin sends Malenkov and Mikhail Litvin of the NKVD to Yerevan. Also, he later sends Mikoyan, as we know, to Yerevan on the anniversary of the execution of the 26 Baku commissars, right? So there is this, so that's the period, the direct intervention, and Stalin literally is supervising everything, every step of the way. I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier podcasts I did with you, maybe the first one, I think it was on Mikoyan, how Stalin was writing to Malenkov all the time, trying to keep up with what was going on, trying to get the information from Malenkov, what's going on. It even was to the point that Stalin sent this journalist, Kotlyarov, to Yerevan from Pravda to cover the events. And why did he pick Kotlyarov? Because he knew that that was the one reporter that Amatuni hated, right? Now, it's interesting because it was almost like a loyalty test. We talk about, of course, Stalin sends Mikoyan there as a loyalty test. But there was also a loyalty test in the sense of Beria too, because in the case of Beria, his cronies are being thrown under the bus. So in advance of Beria's promotion to the all-union NKVD, there was this, kind of test of his loyalty to see if he would accept the purging of his cronies or if he would try and defend them. But he had no compunction. He even attended the interrogation of Amatuni. He was there as Amatuni was tortured and was screaming. So that's what it was like, really.
Yeah. So, Pietro, we covered how this all began with Khanjyan's apparent assassination and murder. We talked about the different phases of the purge. But now I want to focus on the memory and public understanding of the purges, starting with what was the ordinary citizen going through at that time and ending with years later, how did society deal with it? The history of the purges did not end with the release and rehabilitation of the victims. Each later period revised the crimes of the Stalin era in a different way, revealing as much about contemporary Armenia as about the past itself. So tell us, how did Soviet Armenia begin to confront the legacy of the purges during the Khrushchev period? We've talked about this in the past, but what can you say that is relevant to this topic of memory?
Well, I mean, I've talked about it extensively. I mean, I've written a book on it. And really, it begins when Mikoyan comes to Yerevan 2 years before Khrushchev's secret speech and calls for the rehabilitation of Charents, the republication of, Pashinyan and Rafi, the revival of Myasny Khan's memory, and so on and so forth. And that really begins the process of the thaw in Armenia already 2 years before Khrushchev's secret speech, or so-called secret speech. And already in 1954, you have the first victims of the purge being rehabilitated. There is a famous line by the great Russian poetess Anna Akhmatova, who basically talks about this idea that, you know, in the period of the Khrushchev's thaw, in the period of de-Stalinization, that two Russias came to meet eyeball to eyeball. That is to say, the Russia of the victim of the Stalinist repressions, right, the Gulag returnee, and, you know, his former oppressor, right, the Russia of the NKVD guards, right, or the NKVD interrogators, and they came, you know, in her words, to meet eyeball to eyeball. No story better illustrates that, in my point of view, than a story in Armenia where you had this Gulag returnee, Liparit Barsekyan, who came to Yerevan. He came back. He just was released from the Gulag. This is 1954, I believe. And he's on the tram in Yerevan, and he sees this man. He sees this man's face. He recognizes him from somewhere. He doesn't understand where is this guy from, and he makes the association that Barsekyan many years ago, right? I mean, when we talk about always the big thing is 17 years. That from the period of 1937 to 1954, it's about a 17-year period of you know, distance, and how really when he was in the NKVD jail cell, Barsekyan, he was imprisoned with Charents. And this guard came in one day and beat Charents viciously, and beat him and beat him and beat him, to the point that Charents, by the end, wasn't moving. So you know that probably this was the moment where, you know, he died. He was killed, effectively. And Barsekyan, many years later, in 1954, is in Yerevan on the tram. He sees this man. He tries to figure out, who is this? And he recognizes that's the guard that beat Charents to death. And Barsekyan is so angry, he's about to kill the guy. But then the guy gets off at a stop, moves on, and then, you know, that's it. You know, Barsekyan misses his chance. So that's the idea. Two Russias, or two Soviet Unions, because Armenia, I mean, this is more than just Russia. It's also Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, all these other places. Two Soviet Unions coming eyeball to eyeball. That's what we're dealing with in this period of time. And the height of this de-Stalinization was actually in 1961. So everybody talks about the 20th Party Congress, where Khrushchev denounces Stalin. That's almost like a go-to when you talk about the history. But the big de-Stalinization Congress was in 1961, October 1961, the 22nd Party Congress. And this was the Party Congress, gentlemen, where all of a sudden Stalin's statue goes down. You know, the city of Stalingrad is renamed Volgograd, right, at this point. So this is when there was the deep de-Stalinization of the USSR. And this is the moment where, in Victory Park, Stalin's statue is removed from the scene, right? Mikoyan, actually, when he came to Yerevan to give a speech, a day before, when he first arrived in Yerevan, he actually went to the Stalin statue. And the irony was that the speech he gave the next day, on March 11, 1954, would set in motion the process that would eventually result in that statue coming down, right? So that was the first wave of the de-Stalinization, and it could have gotten even more intense. Armenia was a republic that was exceptionally oriented toward de-Stalinization. The society really was strongly in favor of it. There was not only resentment about, you know, Stalin and the repressions and the repressions against the Armenian national identity, but also there was a resentment there about the national territorial issues of that people were raising the issue of, you know, Stalin supporting the incorporation of Nagorno-Karabakh into Soviet Azerbaijan, and people were raising this issue already. We're talking about the first time that that's raised is in this context of de-Stalinization, actually, even before Perestroika.
Pietro, how did Glasnost and Perestroika itself change the public discussion of Stalinism, national history, and repression in Armenia? You did a good job of explaining what happened in the 1950s and 1960s, but let's come to 1980s.
Well, it goes a little bit deeper, because by the time we have the second wave of de-Stalinization, and really this begins, as I mentioned, the flagship of this is Tengiz Abuladze's film Repentance, right? This film was a film that Abuladze made 1984. It was banned in the Soviet Union. Now imagine that, a film banned in 1984. It's great, great, great setup right there. And what happened was when Gorbachev came in, Abuladze, he's Georgian, he was best buddies with Eduard Shevardnadze, right, who kind of came up under Gorbachev's influence. And Abuladze persuaded Shevardnadze to screen the film for Gorbachev. And Gorbachev, when he watched the movie, he cried because his own family had been victims of the Stalinist repressions. And so the film was released in 1987, and it was a flagship of a new wave of de-Stalinization that included, by the way, the rehabilitation of Nikolai Bukharin, who had, he was one of the people jockeying for the post-Lenin leadership in the 1920s alongside Stalin and Trotsky. So in any case, what you ended up having was a situation where in Armenia, suddenly you had a second wave of de-Stalinization, coming to terms with the Stalinist past, right? There was a joke in the Soviet Union at the time because there was also a period of greater, kind of, I guess you could say, sexual liberation. So people would joke that when you turn on the TV during the Gorbachev time, you either saw one of two things, either a naked woman or Stalin. And so suddenly now it was becoming more and more, people were talking about, the Stalinist period much more. And in addition to that, people were beginning to go beyond looking just at Soviet repressions in the Stalinist period. People were also looking at repressions in the early Soviet era, when we talk about kind of the fighting between, Bolsheviks and Dozhnyaks in those very early years, the repression against, leaders of the First Republic, that kind of a thing. That suddenly began to be investigated, right? And then also you had exploration into investigation of those Armenians who were deported, let's say, to the Altai Krai, right? So even today, when we talk about the day of the memory of victims of political repressions in Armenia, it's actually June 14th, which is actually the day which is actually associated with the deportation of these Armenians, many of whom were coming in from the diaspora as repatriates at the end of the war. It's associated with their exile to the Altai region in 1949, which became a new topic of investigation. Also, films like Karot, Yearning, that is for our English language, viewers, they began to deal also more explicitly with the Stalinist past in the Soviet Armenian context. So that's really what we're talking about. There was a second wave of this de-Stalinization under Gorbachev. And actually, it looked like, well, now people are talking about it much more openly during Perestroika. Will it actually translate into more open study of these issues in the Third Republic? And that's actually where it's most interesting, because in the Third Republic, Hovik, the focus on the memory of Stalinism actually becomes less. People are less interested in this question. They're not so much focused on it because the main focus becomes a struggle for the survival of Artsakh, for the right of those people to, like I always say, determine their own future and fight for their own future, and also the preservation, the memory of the genocide. That's another major issue. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what we might be getting at here.
Yeah, it's very interesting, right? Because I also have memories of my family members being taken away to Siberia, but we don't know the details. Those were not even discussed even during the 90s and after the falling apart of the USSR. So this incomplete reckoning in Armenia of the Stalinist repression, how did that leave society less prepared to recognize authoritarian practices in new forms? What do you think about that?
I think that it made people, in some ways, without a complete reckoning of it, I think it made people more permissive to this. And in some ways, the discourses, I was actually quite alarmed, of Stalinism even kind of came back to Armenia, because I remember I was in Armenia during the events of, or actually just after the so-called Velvet Revolution of 2018, and I encountered people who were even saying that we need to crush, we need to smash, the wreckers, we need to smash the Vragi Naroda, that we need to smash the enemies of the people. And I couldn't believe the kind of language I was hearing, because it sounded just like the same kind of things that people would say in 1937 from the documents I was reading, from the research I was doing. So there has not been a complete reckoning with this past. And also, it's not only just a matter of, oh yes, those were such terrible repressions, and it wasn't it awful in those times. It's also there are many different facets of what do the Stalinist repressions mean? There's the uncomfortable fact of Armenian participation in this, the participation of the Armenian society in these repressions. Like, I've seen documents in the Armenian archives where you have local party leaders or local party leaders who are basically kind of condemning their neighbors or their rivals, like that, oh, so and so's wife gave a toast to Khanjyan, and therefore, you know what, you should look at him, maybe he's a Trotskyite or a Dajnak Trotskyite or something like that. People were informing on each other. And the idea, when you take the Stalinist repressions, or you take the repressions in the Soviet Union and say, well, that's on Stalin, or that's on the Soviet government, it has nothing to do with us, that, how can we be capable of such things? Then you erase from that also uncomfortable questions. That's not to, by the way, downplay the agency of Stalin's government and Stalinism, because that's certainly at the forefront of all this. But the incomplete reckoning is when people are, when we talk about incomplete reckoning, it's that people do not make that connection with how the society itself might be complicit in this, how they might play along with something like this for whatever personal reasons, for maybe some personal advancement, for maybe because it's most comfortable, maybe because they don't want to make waves. And there are important lessons to learn from that historical experience that people don't take because they either think it's too distant, or they think they blame it on the Soviet government, and that was then, this is now, how can we, in post-Soviet Armenia, how can that be the case and whatnot? But we're seeing the history, it sounds incredibly cliche for me to say this, but we're seeing the history repeat itself.
Yeah, in fact, I was thinking I was thinking about that meeting between Barseghian and his tormentors, or Charence's tormentors, on the tram. And I just thought to myself, okay, years from now, when all this, hopefully, God willing, is behind us, what will happen when there is a meeting between some of these loyal servants of Pashinyan in national security services and all the victims of that, which is sizable today already?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the institutions, the methods, and the scale may have changed, but we can still recognize from history that these patterns are repeating themselves. The concentration of authority, the subordination of institutions, attacks on the church, the construction of internal and external enemies. And then there's the use of criminal proceedings against rivals, the suppression of competing historical narratives, and the transfer of wealth and property from disfavored groups to a new governing elite. And this is going on today. And I mean today, July 31st, 2026. If you read the news, you will see a number of properties of Zarugyan, who was not even allowed to become an MP in the new parliament. They were confiscated by the Yerevan municipality. So we have to ask ourselves, is Armenia a competitive political system with just major failings, and these things are going to take time to be fixed? Or is it an autocracy which is moving with a show as elections?
Yeah.
And the ruling party just continues controlling institutions, resources, permissible narratives that shape political and social life, just so that the show can go on for the people.
Yeah. And authoritarian systems do not need to use identical methods to pursue political ends. Of course, power can be consolidated through courts, detention, criminal investigations, regulatory pressure, asset seizures, as we said, public vilification. We've seen all of the attacks against the Vehelpar, the replacement of independent political, religious, and cultural elites with figures dependent on the ruling order. And Aspet covered the redistribution of wealth that is going on. So tell us, we started in 2018 from this euphoria that, okay, now we're going to get rid of corruption. Now we're really going to get Artsakh back. Pashinyan was the most nationalistic leader.
Yeah.
And now we have repressions. What happened? Which comparisons between the Great Purge and present-day Armenia are historically useful? And where does this comparison break down?
Well, I think that Well, first of all, I have to say this. I mean, even though I'm no fan, I say this as somebody who is, as you know, a vocal critic of Pashinyan, that is still Stalinism. No, nothing can come close to that in terms of the sheer weight of that. I mean, if there was ever an example in human history that came close to totalitarianism, that would be the regime of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, the dictatorship of Stalin in the Soviet Union. And I think that with Pashinyan, you don't have repression going to that level. Although, you know, I'm concerned of certainly where things are going, because whenever you have already the elimination, you have people being arrested for political reasons, that's a slippery slope to something like people, you know, eventually being executed for political reasons. So I think that it maybe we can say right now, it's certainly not as extreme as what we had in the 1930s. But there are extraordinarily troubling signs. And I think, Osbed, you mentioned about is Armenia just an imperfect democratic republic with all sorts of, you know, shortcomings and imperfections? I mean, you know, problems like this, little kinks in the system. And I think that was really the Armenia that we knew for most of the Third Republic period, right? Occasionally you would have sometimes authoritarian tendencies expressed here and there, but overall, it never was like this. It never got this politically repressive or this controlled or this really authoritarian. This is the most authoritarian. That's why I scoff at those apologists for the government who say things like, well, you know what, the longer Nikol Pashinyan stays in power, maybe forever, then the more democratic Armenia is. That we need this man to be in power forever in order to guarantee democracy in Armenia, right? We actually have people, Hovik, who actually say this. And I'm not even joking. I mean, you know, actually, I don't even need to tell you, you know about that.
And they say, of course, also the loss of Artsakh is Khocharyan's fault. All of the detentions today, you know, the fact that Pashinyan is abusing the constitution to have essentially a super prime ministership in Armenia is Serge Sarkisyan's fault and not Pashinyan's fault. Yeah. Those are the, you know,
and losing the fish markets
arguments.
is Khocharyan's fault.
And also, yes, you know, what's also something else really ridiculous to me, gentlemen, is the fact that, you know, even the abolition of the death penalty in Armenia was under Khocharyan. People forget about this, you know. So it shows you, though. But I mean, but there was never anything like this under the previous presidents in terms of political repressions, in terms of the stifling of freedom of speech, in terms of you know, basically kind of, you had these Armenian, also with restriction on the right to vote. So the government was more than happy to allow people to vote who came from Russia, Armenians who came from Russia. They were more than happy to allow them to vote when it favored them. But when as soon as it didn't favor them, then they were like, well, we're going to send you to a military, you know, training, or, you know, we're going to restrict your ability to come to Armenia in some way or whatever. And now passing laws prohibiting people from taking part in Armenian elections, you know, for a certain amount of time, that kind of a thing. That all of this, I think, speaks to where we are right now is not a good place. It's not a democratic government. It's also not a government that we can say in any way, shape, or form is socially progressive. And what do I mean by that? That we talk about the redistribution of resources. Well, he's not redistributing those resources to help the narod, to help the people, you know. He's basically taking those resources of Gagik Tsarukyan and the others to his cronies, right? So people don't mention this, but Gerzo is doing incredibly well under Pashinyan's government, right? The oligarchs who chose to play ball with Pashinyan are doing really quite well. So it's not in any way, you can say, a progressive government, and it's not a democratic government. It's a government that is increasingly authoritarian. There's very serious questions about academic freedom, as we saw with the Armenian genocide museum you know, question or incident that actually occurred at the beginning of this year. There are actually concerns about being able to freely investigate the Soviet past, because now the government is trying to impose new narratives that say, well, the KGB was behind everything, whatever, even though all the vast bulk of documentary evidence refutes that. So this
Pietro, you talked about the redistribution of wealth, and in one of his speeches, Pashinyan said, we're going to actually nationalize Tsarukyan's businesses, and he used the term azgainatsum, which is different than what the Soviet Union did, which is state ownership. State ownership. In the United States, or in English, I think those two words are very synonymous. But I think that was not accidental, and he tried to paint it. He tried to paint it as an ownership, change of ownership to the people. But in reality, what is happening is, transfer wealth to his cronies. But I think that we're understating the impact of these measures by Pashinyan. And one of the critical things that I keep coming back to is that he uses these permissible methods of detention, right? Pre-trial detention. Yeah. And he gets people in jail 2-3 years, or 1 year or 9 months, and then releases them. And by cycling people, and then he might rearrest them, it is having a net effect of jailing someone for multiple years, preventing them from participating in public life. And this is the most understated aspect. Whenever a foreigner looks at Armenia, he goes, well, the court proceedings are still going on. Let's, withhold judgment. But in reality, these people are already serving their sentence. And then now what's even worse is that Pashinyan is now turning to labeling people as enemies of the state. He calls them traitors. The exact Aragnaz Manukyan, Andranik Tevanyan are being labeled as traitors, criminals, and obstacles to peace. Is this similar to what Stalin did in terms of labeling his opponents as enemies of the state?
Absolutely, absolutely, and actually that's what's so troubling about this, that there are very, very dark echoes of 1937 here, when you have people all of a sudden, you have the government condemning, really the only litmus test is your personal loyalty to the government. If you're not, if you're somebody who's opposed to the government, then they call you an enemy of the people, or an enemy of the state, or a traitor, or whatever. That's exactly what we saw, like in the Soviet Union, for example. The term that Stalin used during collectivization, or that was used during collectivization against the well-to-do peasants, was the term kulak, which is like, fist in Russian. And over time, this term kulak took on a more kind of, open meaning. It could basically mean almost anybody who was opposed to the government. And so we're seeing very, very dark hints of that. And as for Pashinyan's privatization, as for his, his nationalization, of the resources. We also have to think Pashinyan is a man who is of thoroughly neoliberal persuasion. He's a free marketeer through and through. He is somebody who is attempting to really, I guess you could say, push through this AI data center, which is going to cause enormous, immensely deleterious effects on Armenia, right? In terms of pollution, in terms of economic exploitation, in just so many ways. So this is not somebody who is in any way standing for any kind of progressive cause, just so our viewers know.
So as we talked, the Armenian Church presents another important point of comparison. In 1938, as we discussed already, Catholicos Horen I was assassinated during the Soviet campaign by an NKVD agent acting on the orders of Beria. Today, Pashinyan has made replacing the Catholicos Garegin II as a political objective, as a campaign promise, and has continued that campaign even after the election. For instance, tomorrow, or on August 2nd, probably when this podcast interview is published, will be the first session of the new sitting of the parliament. And the government has not invited the Catholicos to be present, which is traditional practice. In fact, they, I think, invited one of the excommunicated priests to participate. And also, more worrisome, the government has launched a criminal case against him for defrocking one of the bishops, which is completely legitimate, is a legitimate authority of the church. So whatever one thinks of church leadership, this has become a struggle over major Armenian institutions and whether they can retain authority independent of the government. How can you compare, Pietro, the Soviet assault on the Armenian Church, the murder of the Catholicos during the Great Purge, and the pressure now being placed on the Catholicos Georgian II?
Well, the first, most immediate parallel is the fact that the church is more than just a religious institution in the Armenian context. It's kind of the, it's, I guess you could say, a vahan. It's something that helps preserve and save the Armenian identity over the centuries. It always was, the church was always playing that role as a protector of Armenian identity. And also, even when we talk about the Soviet government, it always had this kind of off and on relationship with it. I mean, during the period of when the church was being repressed, there was also an effort, and this is quite interesting because it reminds me of today, when Pashinyan is trying to create his own new church that's loyal to him with his own leaders. It's very similar to the Soviet effort to create what they called the living church. They tried to create a Soviet church that would be a counterpoint to the Armenian church, right? And also the same thing was with the Russian Orthodox Church, by the way. And so that's what, there was this idea. And also the other similarity here is that one of the reasons, is particularly when we talk about the Stalinist period, one of the reasons why they were after the church was because it was an institution that was outside the confines of the state. And when something is outside your control, it's kind of hard for you to deal with it, right? Eventually, the Soviet government comes to an understanding with the church. But in the period of Stalinism, there was an effort just simply to wipe out any alternative institutions to the Soviet government. And that's something similar to what we see now under Mr. Pashinyan, under the Armenian government, an effort really to eliminate an alternative pole of authority, an alternative pole of political power. Not even political power, even just cultural power, I mean, because really the church is above politics. It only intervenes in these cases where it feels it's an extraordinary situation, right? A lot of people, who are siding more with Pashinyan when this controversy began, would like to say things like, well, the church interfered in the politics and all this and that. Well, the church, it only interferes in an issue like this if it feels it's so extraordinary to do so. It's usually above the politics. What's more egregious, in my point of view, and this is also something that throws into question Pashinyan's so-called progressive credentials, is this idea that the state should have a role in governing the church, or should, that the boundary between the church and the state should be completely eliminated. So when he says, I want to appoint the Catholicos, right, as if he himself is somehow higher than the Catholicos, that he's higher, than the head of the church, then you begin to have a problem. Then it begins to, question kind of the secular principle of the separation of church and state. That's exactly what he's doing. And that's another, point I would raise when I discuss this. This is not somebody who is for basic, progressive values that we have today that have been handed down to us from the Enlightenment. This is somebody who is just against all that and everything he does.
Okay. So Pietro, I want to pivot to looking forward a little bit. The June 7th parliamentary election resulted in Pashinyan and a civil contract claiming power with 3/5 parliamentary majority, despite all the irregularities, all the state pressure, and obvious falsification. But the question also changed, but the election also changed the structure of the opposition itself. Strong Armenia emerged as the largest parliamentary bloc, while Armenia Alliance entered the parliament as a smaller force. This may mark a shift from an opposition identified mainly in the Karabakh era or Artsakh era political and security leadership towards one organized around businesses, economic management, state capacity, and development. Now, both blocs have accepted their mandates while rejecting the official result. They also argue that parliamentary participation and street politics are not mutually exclusive. So I have a few concerns about this. First, in terms of memory of Artsakh, having the Artsakh leadership have less of a role in Armenian politics seems to, is it in effect having that shaping public memory as well? Because now we're focusing on business, although there's no bigger supporter of Artsakh, I think, than Samuel Karapetyan. Just general, what do you think will happen in Armenian politics today? Can the opposition blocs cooperate and reach voters who reject both Pashinyan and a return to the former political order?
I think the main thing we have to think about when we talk about today's Armenian opposition is the need to consolidate. That I think going into the election, now, of course, there's going to be, some counterpoints to this raised, but going into the election as kind of a, disassociated group of separate opposition parties, that might not have been the best strategy. And actually, this has been one of the points that many people in the opposition have been reflecting on in the aftermath of the election, that one thing we could have done better would have been to, consolidate the opposition. The other thing would be to, if the opposition is, if they're thinking about what strategies to pursue, there was a kind of an either-or choice after the election. This idea that should we do street protests? You were kind of alluding to this. Street protests, or should we, take our mandates in parliament? And I think that the most reasonable position is that, they should do both, because there was this idea that we should refuse mandates in parliament and all this and that. But I think that it's important for them to do both, but also to seize opportunities if there's going to be mass mobilization, to do that. Because one thing that also struck me about the aftermath of the June election was that, or so-called election, because it was thoroughly rigged, was that there was evidently no plan B. There were some oppositionists who were saying, let's go to the streets. Some who were saying, let's challenge this, legally, through legal avenues. I don't even see the sensibility of doing that when the legal structures, like the Central Election Commission, are all controlled by Pashinyan. It doesn't make any sense. So there has to be a change of strategy. There has to be a greater consolidation. I don't think, just because Robert Kocharyan got less in the parliament, I don't think it means that the role of Artsakh or the role of Artsakh is going to be less in the movement. I think also it's important for the opposition to continue addressing the social question, because that is something that I think is intimately intertwined with the national security issue as well. So I think that if you combine national security with the social question, with also the question of democracy, because this government has proven itself to be an opponent of democracy, then you can't go wrong with such a mix as that. So I think the opposition will learn these lessons. They're learning as they're going along. Each time they seem to be getting closer and closer and closer and closer to the result that they get. But it's like anything else. I mean, when we talk about in revolutions in history, revolutions don't succeed. They don't become a huge success on the first try. So you remember very well from the history of Cuba, right? Now Cuba is in the news, it's under siege, as we know. But Fidel Castro had the attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953. It was a failed revolt. What did he do? He went into exile, right? He was in Mexico for a while. Then he and his comrades, including Che Guevara, they went on the Grandma boat, and then they came to Cuba and they launched a guerrilla war in the mountains in Cuba. And so eventually that revolution turned out to be a success, but it shows you, Hovik, that it's never a success all in one go. It's a trial and error process. Now, that being said, the opposition has to think about the immediacy of the situation, because Armenia is facing existential threats on many, many different fronts. Threats to its national identity, threats to its national security, threats to the social security of its citizens, threats on so many levels that you can't believe. Just look at the city of Rapan. Look at now, literally, it's Azerbaijan is literally right there, right on the city limits of Rapan. Right, that wasn't the situation before 2020. So now there's so much to contend with, and so much of an immediacy to act, that the opposition has to be forced to consolidate. That they should understand that this is not the typical post-Soviet Armenian politics as usual. This is an extraordinary situation. That's the other critique I have. The opposition needs to be aware that this is an extraordinary situation. It's not a usual business as usual, politics as usual situation. This is an extraordinary situation. That your national identity, your statehood is at stake. The existence of your people is at stake. And like for instance, the new front now, I mean, Artsakh, this is of course an issue that should always be on the minds of Armenians, and of course the Artsakh leadership as well, the captives in Baku. At the same time, also the security of Sunnik, because now Sunnik is suddenly the front line. The people of
Yeah,
Sunnik
yeah,
are under threat, with not only from this government in Armenia or from Aliyev's threats, but even with this Trump trip corridor. That's to
yeah.
sell, the southernmost part of Sunnik to an American company for, I guess it was, I mean, it was like I think 70 years. I think that was the limit. I mean, this is all threats, and also the fact that it exposes Armenia to major threats vis-a-vis its two most important allies and security providers, Russia and Iran, in a world that is fast changing. So yeah.
Yeah. Pietro, thanks for this discussion. I want to underscore that the history of the purges reminds us that authoritarian power does not stop at elections, prisons, or political parties. It reaches into institutions like we discussed. It reaches into property, public memory, and private grief. All of those are being attacked today. It defines enemies, rewards loyalty, weakens independent authority, and narrows the range of ideas and identities that society may express or is allowed to express. So I'd like to end today's discussion with a quote from Milan Kundera's The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. It says, "The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." Quite powerful words. I remember reading this in college. I have to reread it again, and I would strongly recommend this book as well as The Unbearable Lightness of Being. I know some people may not like Kundera, but if you don't know this author, I would strongly urge you to give those books a try. Thank you, Pietro, for this discussion. I think it was fascinating.
One more thing,
Yeah.
Hovik. I just want to say this. When we talk about, the history of mobilization, I mean, we talk about mobilizations in history against, autocratic governments, authoritarian governments. People should always remember, and this is something also that even Czechoslovak dissidents would remind you about, that the people are the ones who ultimately hold the power. They are the majority. People should never think that this government is so onerous and so oppressive on us that we can't do anything. They have the numbers. The people have the numbers. They have the power to change the situation if they so want. And I think the people in Armenia do. They do want to change the situation. And I think eventually, you know what? I'll even go so far as to say this, Hovik, they will change the situation. Because a government like this will not last for long, and it will be hopefully remembered. I mean, it will be remembered in our history, I believe, as a terrible nightmare that we can only be glad that we woke out of. So on that note, I think that one day we will come to our Barsekian, Charin's tormentor, moment. And I also hope that people will.
Well, I hope we're ready for that, because we have to have a reckoning as powerful, and I don't know what shape that will take. Thank you, Pietro, again for this discussion. This was fascinating, and I hope our listeners and viewers enjoyed it. And I can't wait until we have our next discussion, Pietro.
Thank you, Hovik. Thank you, Asbed. Thank you.
What an interesting show. We recorded this episode on July 31st, 2026. And we've been talking to Dr. Pietro Shakarian, who is a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union. He's the author of the book Anastas Migoyan, an Armenian reformer in Khrushchev's Kremlin. And you should read that book, because there's a lot of interesting detail that Pietro would have probably told us on the show, but he didn't have time. Dr. Shakarian's analysis on Russian and post-Soviet affairs have appeared in various national and international publications. He currently lectures in history at the American University of Armenia, the AUA, in Yerevan. For more information, go to podcasts.groong.org/episode number. Make sure you click on his bio. Check out the link to his book. It's very interesting.
Yeah. I don't know about you personally, Asbed, but I really enjoyed the merging of contemporary issues with history today. I hope the parallels worked. What did you think about it?
I'm not sure enjoying is the right word. I was alarmed at the parallels between history about 80 years ago, 90 years ago, and today. I think it's just, like I said, it's kind of hard to believe that we can forget any part of history, because it keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. Hovig, what makes this doubly worrying for us is that just this past week, lawsuits have been filed, indictments have been filed against Khocharyan, against Samvel Garavedian. These are post-election suits. Deputy of Zarugyan himself, his properties are being confiscated today. A Yerevan
Even his
municipality has
Yerevan
confiscated.
gym.
That's right. This
I used to
Yerevan
go to that gym. I used to go to that. That's my gym.
And, you know, the sentence basically says that the Yerevan municipality has simply confiscated the property according to their own terms. It's like, we don't even know. They just come, they close the place. And on Armen Press, if you read the article, it says basically they have rebranded the gym because most of Zarugyan's properties are basically like multi, I think, or something like that, right? Anyway, and that's not the end of it. Of course, this past week, we also saw charges, indictments brought against the Catholicos, Garekin too. And he's supposed he's due to appear in court. And you know what I think would be appropriate? That 200,000 citizens of the Republic of Armenia show up at court and make sure that they can't even take him in court. To do what? To read some bullshit charges against the Catholicos. I hope 200,000 Armenians will show up.
We're in solidarity with all of the oppressed opposition, all of the people that are victims of this Pashinyan purge. And we promise not to let down. And in order to do that, we'd also like your support. Go to podcast.groong.org/donate and show us that you really care, if you can, of course, and also provide us a monetary donation so we can streamline our activities and be able to give you more content and more efforts to cover what's going on in Armenia and not forget. Thank you. This is Hovik Manucharyan.
And I'm Asbet Bedrosian. We will talk to you soon.